I bought a house that ended up in my sister's name, and I was shocked. At 29, I'm paying the mortgage for a house I bought from my parents, but they later transferred it to my sister as a gift, something they never told me about. I always felt like my parents favored my 27-year-old sister, Tiffany, but this was a wake-up call about how far they went for her. Growing up, I was taught to be responsible, while Tiffany was pampered and allowed to do whatever she wanted without any pressure about school. My parents pushed me hard to get an education and build a career. After high school, instead of letting me use my savings or get a student loan, they took on debt themselves, claiming it was to protect me from financial stress. I thought they were helping, but when I started my career, I felt like I owed them big time. They would constantly remind me of their sacrifices, which seemed like a way to keep me grounded at first, but I realized it was emotional manipulation to get me to do what they wanted. The pressure was intense, and when I started working, they would visit and ask about my job and success, constantly reminding me of their support. One holiday dinner, my dad made it clear they expected me to buy them a house because they could no longer afford to rent after spending their savings on my education. It felt like a huge burden, and I couldn't shake the feeling of obligation. I never thought I'd buy a house so early in my career. I was only a year into my first job and still living with roommates. The idea seemed impossible, but my parents insisted. "Dad, I can't even afford a place on my own yet," I said. He firmly replied, "We raised you to set goals and work toward them." My mom added, "Without our help, you wouldn't have gone to college. Now it's time to repay us." I felt overwhelmed but didn't argue. I knew I owed them, but their expectations felt suffocating. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront them. So I pulled away from them, only responding to emergency calls and using my work as an excuse not to visit. But the idea of buying them a house stayed with me. After 6 years of saving and working extra hours, I finally bought them a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. I thought it would bring peace, so I continued paying the mortgage for 5 years, making extra payments when I could. Even though I had other dreams, like buying my own place or traveling, the pressure to meet my parents' expectations eased once the house was secured. They probably told friends about how their investment in my education paid off. I didn't talk to them much, but the emotional distance was still there. After months of working hard, I decided to visit them. I noticed Tiffany's car in the driveway, even though she hadn't been around much. When I knocked, she greeted me in pajamas. Surprised, she asked, "What are you doing here?" I asked about our parents, and she casually told me, "Oh, they moved out." I was confused, so I asked, "Moved out?" "This is their house." She shrugged. "I guess they didn't tell you. They gave me the house. I live here now." I couldn't believe it. The house I worked so hard to buy was now in Tiffany's name, and my parents never told me. Tiffany said it like it was no big deal. "They said I needed it more with the baby on the way," she explained. I asked where our parents were, and Tiffany casually said they were renting an apartment across town. I left in a daze and went straight to their new place. When my mom opened the door, I couldn't hold back. "What's going on?" "Tiffany told me you gave her the house I've been paying for." "Why didn't you tell me?" My mom calmly told me to come inside. "Calm down. We've been thinking about this for a while. You're successful. You don't need to worry." She said that Tiffany needed the house for her family and wouldn't have to worry about rent. I was furious. "I don't care where my niece or nephew grows up." I snapped. "It's not my job to fix Tiffany's finances. If she needs stability, she should work for it, not expect handouts." My dad joined in, defending them. "Why are you making such a fuss? Tiffany needs stability. We couldn't give her the same chances we gave you." I was stunned. "That's crazy. She didn't even go to college." They dismissed my feelings, saying I could just buy another house. Sure, I could buy a new house, but why should they decide that for me? Their treatment made me feel like my hard work didn't matter. I stormed out, needing space to think. I checked into a hotel to cool off and collect my thoughts. Since finding out about this last Friday, I've been struggling with what to do next. I'm supposed to fly back on Tuesday, but I've realized there's still more I need to figure out, especially about the mortgage. I've made extra payments, so it might be almost paid off. I texted my dad asking about the mortgage, and he said he'd check with the loan manager. "I'm coming to the bank tomorrow. I need to see the balance for myself," I told him. I don't want to keep paying for a house that's no longer mine, especially since they've taken my efforts for granted. I replied, "Yes, of course. Why else would I send extra money?" But what he said next shocked me. I had believed the extra money was for our shared expenses. This mix-up, or maybe a deliberate lie, deepened my feeling of betrayal and left me tangled in my family's financial secrets. I had to rethink my relationship with my family and how I handled money with them. My father admitted that he used the extra money I sent for the mortgage to pay their rent instead. I felt overwhelmed and betrayed. I slumped into a chair, burying my face in my hands, wondering how I could ever look my parents in the eye again. Trying to calm me down, my father said, "It's not that big of a deal." I couldn't hold back my anger. "Not a big deal? You pushed me into buying a house, then gave it to Tiffany without telling me, and even used my money meant for the mortgage to pay your rent? How is that okay?" He defended himself by saying, "The house never benefited you. I spent all my savings on your college, so a little payback isn't too much to ask. I even made the mortgage payments on time. What's wrong with using the extra money for rent? I'm not asking you for more money." His excuses only made me angrier. The extra money was meant to pay down the mortgage early, not for rent. I left the bank, my head spinning with betrayal and disbelief. My father called after me, but I kept walking, heading straight for the subway station. Soon, my phone buzzed nonstop with calls and texts from my mother begging, "Come home so we can talk." I ignored them. The idea of discussing this was too painful. I knew I had to stand up for myself. My generosity had been exploited, and I felt I had every right to be angry and set strict boundaries. Determined to put my well-being first, I went home, trembling with anger, and decided to break my routine. When the new month began, I stopped sending the mortgage payment. I decided that if my parents meant for Tiffany to have the house, she should be responsible for the mortgage, not me. I blocked my father's calls, and I also blocked my mother, Tiffany, and her husband. I wanted peace and refused to let their manipulation continue. When my parents realized I had stopped paying, they became furious. I received many calls and voicemails from unknown numbers, probably friends, trying to reach me. Despite all this, I stood firm. I would no longer let their decisions control my life or my money. Even when my parents cried that they couldn't afford the mortgage without me, I simply laughed inside. It was no longer my problem. I blocked every new number they tried to contact me with. Then, 5 days later, I came home from work and found my father waiting at my doorstep, visibly angry. "This can't end like this. You owe us. We sent you to college and made you who you are today," he yelled. I snapped back, "I've already paid more than enough. Do you have any idea how much I've contributed to the mortgage? It's way more than what you spent on my college tuition. I owe you nothing." He called me ungrateful, but I refused to let him guilt me any further. "Stop it," I said firmly. "I'm done paying for your rent or any other expenses. That's your responsibility, not mine. You raised me like an investment to cash in later. I'm not just an asset for you to use." With that, I left him at the door, got into my car, and drove away. I even avoided going back to my apartment right away, afraid he might follow me. When I finally returned that night, he was gone. In the days that followed, my phone was flooded with calls and messages. My mother left desperate voicemails, and Tiffany sent a long message trying to explain why the house was so important for her family. She even called me selfish for not supporting them. But I felt a strong sense of freedom from their control. My relationship with them was over. Soon, financial problems caught up with them. Tiffany struggled to make the mortgage payments, and my parents couldn't pay the rent on their apartment without my help. I had expected this outcome. It was only a matter of time. About a year later, I heard that the house was put up for sale. My parents tried to save it with their savings and retirement funds, but it wasn't enough. Tensions grew when they asked Tiffany and her husband to split half of the mortgage costs, saying they couldn't handle it alone. Tiffany, however, insisted that the house was a gift and that my parents should pay for it all. That's when my parents finally realized their mistake. Everything fell apart, showing that their expectations and broken promises were unsustainable. Our family bonds were shattered, and everyone had to face the consequences. When the house was eventually auctioned and sold, my father managed to get back a significant sum from the sale. Although it hurt, it was probably for the best. Looking back at all the money I spent, the down payment and mortgage payments, I had to accept that I would never get that money back. They never planned to reimburse me, and accepting this was a necessary step in moving on. Now, there's no more pretending that they were generous or that they did me a favor. I've accepted that I paid for my college education completely, even with the extra interest. This closure has freed me from feeling guilty about cutting ties with them, whether they were family or not. The financial score is settled. I later heard from relatives and my uncle that my parents had downsized and moved into a smaller apartment to save money. They began managing the money from the house sale wisely, preparing for retirement without expecting any more support from me. My relationship with Tiffany also changed. My parents stopped giving her money and insisted she take responsibility for her own family. Even though Tiffany tried to make me feel guilty for not helping, my parents held firm. This new arrangement is healthier for everyone and marks a big change in our family. For me, I now have my own apartment, a place that represents my independence and a fresh start. I'm saving money to buy a house that will be entirely mine, a safe space free from family drama and obligations. Although breaking away from my family was painful, it was necessary for my well-being and independence. I learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the people closest to you can take advantage of your kindness. This chapter was painful, but it helped me grow and learn who I truly am. I don't regret my choices. My decision is clear. I deserve respect and fair treatment, whether it comes from family or strangers. Even though it's sad to see my family break apart, I also feel relief that they now face the truth about their actions. I'm free from the guilt and obligation that once held me back, and I can now focus on building a future that respects my values and my contributions in every part of my life.